And welcome to Civil Discourse. I'm Jayme Marilyn.
And I'm Marilyn Brown.
And today we are discussing, the two big controversies that happened earlier this week in comedy. The first being Kathy Griffin and the photo she put on Instagram. Was that the place for it? That she posted of her with a severed head of Donald Trump, and secondly, the Bill Maher controversy of him using the N word in a joke on his show, and very nonchalantly, and then not refusing to apologize for it. So let's go in order. Let's start with the Kathy Griffin, and just I'm just curious what your views are of it. I guess a few days after it happened.
Yeah, so my views, I definitely um, disagree with the picture, with the action that she took. I mean, I'm a nonviolent person, and so seeing images like that, I don't think help, and I think adding any kind of violence to the conversation makes things worse. And so, I didn't like it. I definitely was not a fan of it. Um, but I also see that I do believe in free speech, and I think that, she is a comedian, and so that was her choice to do it. And it was CNN's choice as someone who is, paying her to, do their New Year's Eve and maybe some other appearances for them to not employ her anymore. I think that makes sense as their choice to do that because they disagreed with it. But it was interesting to me, how much, not just how much people were talking about it, because I get it. It was a very shocking image, but what really just kind of sticks with me is how much people are really, really continuing to kind of just discuss how horrible it is, that their view that it's really horrible what she did, and kind of just really continuing to add all of this to the conversation, and how um there's kind of a resistance to accepting her apology, and kind of, and it's interesting because I mean she apologized pretty immediately, and her first apology, she seemed very sincere. She, it was not one of those kind of characteristic non-apology apologies that we'll see in situations like this. She sounded very, very, and looked very remorseful. And there were, again, consequences that CNN chose to terminate their relationship with her, which that's their choice. And I think for her to accept those consequences, but it was just like, I felt like it was used as an opportunity to change or skew the narrative and start to say, see, this is the left and this is kind of what we're seeing, and kind of use it as an example of what people who are resistant to Donald Trump's administration are doing. And that really bothered me. It didn't surprise me, but it's bothered me.
Right, especially when really it's not a, a left problem. It's something that happens. I mean, that happened nonstop during President Obama's presidency. So it's just something that people do when they're angry, and I think they don't really know how to mindfully express themselves, or they want shock value. The thing I found interesting about it was that she seemed to, at least to me, sincerely not have anticipated the negative reaction to it. And when she was talking
Yeah.
about it, you could see the, I don't want to say the hate for Donald Trump, but kind of how his rhetoric has kind of almost tormented her in a way, is kind of how I got it. So it was not justifying what she did, because I agree with you completely. But it just, I think there's a more mindful discussion that's not happening because the reaction was so emotional from the public, and really from Donald Trump, and then became so quickly political that any kind of talk about really what is art and what is free speech and where is the line and what was the intention, all these things were kind of skipped in a
Right.
way, and it went. I think I did feel bad for her because I feel, even though I don't agree, I
Mhm.
don't. I think, I mean, as someone who tries to be mindful, you have to approach it from a place of understanding. And when CNN fired her, I thought that, to me, it made sense. They're a very specific brand, and that type of action can really hurt their brand as a news organization if they show kind of any sign of supporting it, or allowing that kind of speech. So I got it. But then she was also, I'm pretty sure every show that she had planned was canceled because the venues refused to allow her to perform, which is also their right. But then there was all this stuff with, and it's been vague, so I don't know how much is true and what the specifics
Right.
are about Donald Trump actually going after her and wanting there to be an investigation, which would be paid for by tax dollars.
Right.
And I just don't see how that's warranted, because even though I don't agree with it, I don't see, and people can disagree with me, this is just me, I don't see any intent in it for of a threat.
Yes.
There was
Yes.
nothing in it, like, yeah,
Yeah.
it was tasteless and it was violent, but
Right.
nothing in it hinted that it was a threat on the life of the president. And I think that's an important thing to recognize, on if they're going to try to push criminal charges and all these things. And I think that's where that line of free speech comes in,
Right.
because it wasn't a threat.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. And actually, thinking about that point, that it wasn't a threat. And also, look at what happened to President Obama, which you referenced to earlier in your response, that, there were actual threats made against President Obama, against his family. I mean, it was a constant stream of derogatory, racist, disgusting, offensive things that were taught, that were lobbed at his family on certain news networks for the entire duration of his presidency, and even still now. And those things are considered free speech. It's, well, get over it. That's my opinion. It's free speech. Okay, that's fine. So where are the consequences? It's fine if it's free speech, but then when it's Kathy Griffin and it's free speech and clearly it's not a threat, I know that people were saying that, there was reports out of the White House that his son saw it and thought it was real, and that's awful. And yet most people know that that wasn't a threat, and know that that wasn't real, and that it was art, tasteless art, but art. And, but it's, to me, it just shows a lot of the problem is that we really are still living in a very, very white supremacist society, where the consequences, if it's, against a white president, are going to be much different than when it was, the consequences against President Obama, and for how he was treated throughout his presidency. And you see it, not to jump and go into the Bill Maher discussion, but I think, that's some of what really frustrates me about some of the reactions to what's going on with Bill Maher, is that I really feel like it again highlights that discrepancy.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think we can kind of. I have one more thing I would like to say, but I think we can move into the Bill Maher thing, because a lot of my thoughts are kind of about how they compare. But
Mm-hmm.
I think a big part of the Kathy Griffin thing for me is the hypocrisy that I've seen, and in two different places. One thing that really, and it didn't surprise me, but it just gave me a lot of pause, was when she was talking about the death threat she was getting. And it's interesting that people would be so outraged that they would think, and I believe that they see that and think it's a threat on the president's life. And for them, I'm sure that's awful to think that. But to then be so outraged that someone, in their opinion, threatened the president's life, to then go threaten that person's life, is just, I mean, it's the definition of hypocrisy in my view. And I think that's where the mindfulness is lacking. And I think it's hard. I was thinking about this a lot, and I was we weren't going to talk about the London attacks because it's kind of new and all the information is not out there yet. But I see it with a lot of the terrorist act. I see it with everything, and I think it's just the age of social media and it still being so new, is that nothing is processed anymore. People have an immediate emotional reaction, which I think is what is natural to humans. But the difference was, before social media, before that, those reactions were public, they simmered, and the intellect was able to be brought in to kind of sift through what was just emotion and what was based in fact. And it was a little more processed, where now it's so immediate that the first thing you see is the emotional response, which is often completely unmindful and in a lot of ways irrational. But then that kind of heightens the situation in a way, because then it causes other people who wouldn't be emotional to be emotional, and it kind of, I think, keeps people in that heightened emotional state and unable to go into the critical thinking stage, if that makes sense. And then the second thing I think was very hypocritical was, I feel if what Trump said about his son is true, I think that's horrific. But there are also, in Trump's statements, I just find a hypocrisy that he was one of the ones who was celebrating people who were threatening Obama. So it's just,
he was the leader of the birther movement that, continued to deny his citizenship, and his kids had to see that. His kids had to hear those reports.
Right. And Ted Nugent was brought into the White House after he made multiple threats to Obama's life. So it's just, there's either it's either just plain out hypocrisy, or there's some kind of disconnect there, that for some reason Trump is different than Obama, and then therefore it's not okay for him, but it was okay for Obama, and just free speech here and not free speech there. Right. I think it's probably a combination of both, but yeah.
Yeah, I definitely think it's hypocrisy, and I think it's hypocrisy, to maintain power, to keep himself in a certain position. Most of the things he does are pretty hypocritical. The things that he's criticized President Obama for. I mean, you look at his Twitter, and it's just like this laundry list of old things that are like coming back to bite him in the butt. These old statements that he made of I wouldn't do this, and if a president did that, and it's like every single one are things that he's doing, but because now he's the president, it's just supposed to be accepted, and we're supposed to accept everything without impunity and not question anything, and not hold him to even the standards of the Constitution, and so, I mean, everything that happens is some form of hypocrisy. I mean, you look at, talking about terrorism, you look at how much terrorism is going on in the United States against people of color and marginalized communities, and he is so quiet about those things. I mean, you could see that with the attacks, the horrific attacks that happened in Portland, where three people were attacked, and 2 men lost their lives at the hands of someone who was verbally attacking and harassing these 2 young Muslim women. And it's just like, he didn't say anything about that for days until there was kind of this generic statement put out about it. But yet, if there's even a hint of maybe this is the kind of terror that I think fits the narrative that he's trying to push right now, that we need to be afraid of Muslims, then he's immediately on it and using it as an example to promote his travel ban, and
Right.
so it's really so obvious, the level of hypocrisy, because I mean, we're seeing it all the time, and yet we're being told not to pay attention to it and not to ask questions.
Right. And in my view, there's two types of hypocrisy. There's the hypocrisy I see with sending Kathy Griffin death threats, where I don't think most of those people are aware of that hypocrisy. They're
Mm-hmm.
just
Yes.
reacting, they're reacting to violence by breeding more violence
Mm-hmm.
in a way is what's happening, and they're just
Right.
moving the cycle. And
Right.
then you have kind of that political hypocrisy you're talking about with Trump, but is all, I mean, both parties do it ever. It's just that's what our politics has become, where it's a
Strategic. Yeah.
very strategic hypocrisy to push whatever their specific agenda is.
Yeah. An
And
example of that is I'm just rewatching Ava DuVernay's The 13th on Netflix. You haven't watched it. I try to watch it every few months or so because it's just so informative. But thinking about the hypocrisy of sentencing between powder cocaine and crack cocaine and the
right.
impact on the Black community, how strategically and specifically that was done to impact communities of color, and so that's a prime example of how that political, like, kind of strategic hypocrisy plays out versus, I think, like you said, what you're seeing with people who just, it's more kind of conditioned lack of awareness, unmindful hypocrisy that I think all of us on some level engage in our lives. I mean, but I think
Right,
that there's, there's that kind of just we're when we're not mindful, we can be very hypocritical. And so I think there's that versus institutions strategically doing things to continue injustice. And
Right. And
that's what that's, I think, what's really more frustrating for me, that we're seeing a lot more of right now.
I mean, that is mindfulness. Mindfulness comes from Buddhism, where the goal really is enlightenment. And the idea of enlightenment is really breaking the cycle. And that is what mindfulness allows you to do. And we're, as humans, as emotional beings, hypocrisy is in our blood when we don't bring an awareness to those emotions and to the world around us, because we react on instinct. And that's where a lot of that hypocrisy comes from, when it's not manipulative and strategic. Yeah.
Yeah.
So moving on to Bill Maher.
Yes.
Do you want to just give a quick breakdown of what happened and your thoughts on it?
Yes, I definitely will. So on Friday night, Bill Maher's episode of Real Time with Bill Maher, which airs on HBO, he decided to really, I don't know, it came out of his mouth so easily. That's the thing that really trips me out about it. He was just like, well, I'm a house nigger, and just said it very, very easily. And and then there was applause from the audience. He kind of did a little, wave it off, ha, oh shucks. And then they moved on, and there was an immediate backlash, which, makes a lot of sense, because this is not something that's okay for him to say. And I feel very strongly about that. So my reactions when I saw it come up on my Twitter feed that he said it, I was like, oh, well, I wasn't super surprised, because I haven't been
It's Bill Maher.
a fan of Bill Maher for a while. I will pop in and watch certain episodes of his show. Like there was Maya Wiley was on a couple of months ago now, and so I'll watch every once in a while if he has somebody specific that I want to hear from. But otherwise, I tend to avoid it because he says pretty offensive things and tends to give himself a pass to do so a lot of times because he is a liberal and he's on the left, and so. So that was kind of how it happened. And one thing that really stuck out to me was that initially he didn't apologize. He has since apologized, which is which was surprising for me because Bill Maher tends to double down on things like this and really not apologize. I think that he apologized because he saw the level of um, outcry about it. I mean, people are calling for HBO to drop his show, to end Bill Maher's show. I mean, there's huge, huge names of people that are like tweeting HBO should sever their relationship with Bill Maher. And so I think that he saw that there may be some serious consequences for this if he just doesn't say anything. And so he apologized, but the difference between his apology for me and what Kathy Griffin says is it just seemed much less of an actual acknowledgement of the impact of what he said and what he did. It was just like, okay, I said something that offended people. You guys didn't like it. Whoops. It slipped out. I don't know if that word slips out of your mouth, but the fact that it slipped out concerns me.
Yeah.
But okay, it slipped out, and he wants people to just kind of move on from it. And the other thing that really bugged me is so much of the commentary is leave Bill alone. He apologized, move on, move on. I was looking on Twitter today, and like Donna Brazile had a statement saying, he apologized, let's move on. And it's and that brings to my awareness and reminds me of that continued kind of trauma that Black people have been suffering in this country that's so tied to that word since we've been here. Is that, okay, these things happen, sorry, move on, get over it, forgive, let it go, but without any corrective action, without any kind of justice or acknowledgement or correction to the damage that's been made.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the Donna Brazile, it's hard because there's a political agenda there. He's very, very tied to the Democratic Party, so that just makes sense to me that they would want him to be left alone because he brings in a lot of money and is very much a mouthpiece for what they're trying to do and what they're thinking. So, yeah.
But is she? I'm not familiar. What is her current position within the Democratic Party?
I have no idea.
Okay, so she's not like, because it's now Perez. Is that
right? Yeah.
So
I'm sure she's working with like transition or something.
Right. I could see that, but I also think then it strikes me as interesting that they have the Black person who's no longer the voice of the party making that statement in support. It's like, okay, well, if that was the Democratic Party saying kind of leave him alone, he makes a lot of money, I would think, maybe it would be somebody else. But a lot of times that's also what happens is that Black people are sent out to tell Black people to calm down,
Yeah.
and to no, it's okay, don't worry about it. He's cool. It's fine.
And that's strategic because if it was
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, Fox News is notorious for that. They find specific people to trot out and perpetuate their narrative. And so, but the thing with Bill that really strikes me is that people keep saying it's a joke. It's a joke, and so we keep hearing it's a joke, but slavery isn't a joke. And it's still affecting people. And that's the thing that I think, I really was thinking about this morning. And I think that even just that idea of like it's in the past is such a privileged position to take.
Right.
People who have had this lives affect their ancestors and themselves and their communities and their families since we've been here and will continue to affect us. There's no way that you can just say it's in the past. And so making a joke about slavery and this, it was so long ago, it was in the past, is a position of privilege that I think people really need to kind of be aware of and see, because this is affecting Black people as individuals on a day-to-day basis, Black communities, Black families, and has, the entire time. So that part really kind of struck me that, again, we're hearing like, move on. It's okay, give him a break. He apologized, but this is still, I still, when I get in my car, realize that I'm a Black person in a car with you know, driving alone and feeling that
Hmm.
fear in certain situations.
So, well, what do you think is the mindful way to, I guess, have these conversations? Because what I've seen is the reaction. I mean, it's there's no other way to say it. The way people are reacting is divided on race. I've seen the vast majority of white people are the ones saying it's just a joke.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of that
Makes sense.
narrative, and then you have the black community who's outraged. And what ends up happening is, I see my black friends telling my white friends that they shouldn't have an opinion, and then because it doesn't affect them, and then you have the my white friends telling my black friends, well, it's just a joke, and you have to take in the intention. You have to consider the intention. So it's both. I see both kind of. I don't like using the word sides, but kind of both groups telling the other group to how they should react to it,
Mm-hmm.
and as opposed to there actually being any kind of dialogue. And I think a lot of it is because people don't have no clue how to have that dialogue, or what's
Right.
appropriate, or how to be sensitive but still have an opinion. Because in my view, and I was telling, because I posted about just what happened, and specifically about just that there was a lot of comparison between and praise for CNN for firing Kathy Griffin, and then that was used to attack HBO, to try to force them to make the same decision. So I had just said nothing about really Bill Maher, because I'm not a fan of Bill Maher. I don't agree with what he did at all.
Mm-hmm.
But that those two decisions are completely different, because when you fire Kathy Griffin from her New Year's Eve show, you're firing Kathy Griffin. When you fire Bill Maher from a show that is his and without him will be canceled and not exist, you're firing not only him, but the hundreds of people who work on that show. Which isn't to say that that's a reason why he shouldn't be fired, but it's just not the same choice. So it's going to take HBO longer to come up with a decision, and there's just more nuance in that. And I was kind of bringing I was just bringing that comparison to light.
Uh-huh.
And it obviously, and I should have expected it. It didn't stay on that topic, and it kind of went off with people
Yeah.
kind of yelling at each other. And it literally just became people telling others to stay silent, or telling them how to think, as opposed to being mindful and trying to understand. But
Mm-hmm.
where's our coming from, and just the nuance. I think a lot of it is so, like, I mean, for lack of a better phrase, black and white is how people try to make it, and then they don't want to discuss the nuance, maybe because it's uncomfortable. Like, I don't know what it is, but I had no clue how to move it to a mindful place.
Right. I think the hard thing, so like going back to the post, I do think that it is a different decision for HBO, and it's not the exact same thing. And people tend to equate the two and just kind of immediately say, that one needs to influence the other. They're completely separate, but I also do still feel like um, HBO, and I tend to wonder, and I think that this is because, my entire experience has been the Black experience of my life. I tend to wonder, well, what would it have been if he had said something extremely offensive to women, or extremely offensive to, yeah, women overall? Because I look at, the rhetoric that Donald Trump spewed throughout his campaign, and people waited to be really, really outraged. Most people weren't really outraged and bothered by him until he said the grab him by the pussy comment, and so I just, again, I wonder, I think, yeah, it's a different decision, but I wonder how quickly, or how, how it would have been dealt with
Yeah, it's
if
a different
it was a
decision.
different victim. Because I do feel like, we are living in a world where um, Black people are not allowed to be victims, and yet we're constantly being victimized. And so, I mean, you look at, and this is the other thing that really bothered me about Bill Maher is that, what he said, and callously bringing up slavery as a joke, and calling himself what he did, again, that's still affecting our communities. I mean, there was a Black man, Richard Collins III, that was assassinated, that was terrorized and murdered, by a white supremacist, and our president isn't saying anything about it, and that's a concern, because if there's a continued allowance of these type of actions, and then also we're being told don't feel anything when this trauma is brought up, Black people are frustrated and left feeling like, well, no, you don't get to say what I should feel. And so I think that part of what I think has to be having a mindful discussion is recognizing, unfortunately, not everybody's opinions on everything are the same and carry the same weight, and are as valid. So if you want to have a mindful discussion with someone about what's okay and what's not, being willing to take the stance that you do know less, that you do have less of a perspective, that you do have more to learn from a Black person about how racism affects Black people, and the the effects of this, than someone who's white, and being able to just accept that. We have to be able to accept where we're coming from if we're going to be able to learn and actually make any progress. And oftentimes what I see is that, especially in a lot of kind of Facebook and Twitter battles that people get into about race, it's when it doesn't go anywhere, when it turns into kind of one of these battles, oftentimes it's because the white person, who a lot of times is someone who considers themselves an ally, is fighting for special permission to, not, I don't know, to not be, it's like the person doesn't want to be seen as being a part of our white supremacist society, but yet our society is white supremacist and we're all a part of it. And so a lot of times I think people get frustrated when they feel like they're being labeled as something, but rather than actually just looking at what the person who's saying, this is my life and this is how this affects me and this is the trauma that I'm dealing with because of it, the person who is arguing with them is more concerned with not being viewed as being a part of it.
Right. And that's pretty much what I exclusively see. Is normally it's a white person who posts, and then a white person comments, and then a Black person responds, and then it becomes no one can, I have to prove myself, and then that's kind of what it becomes, and it just it becomes a mess. The other thing
it becomes, don't attack me. A lot of times, I mean, you see that Black people are told that we're attacking when we're responding to or pointing out, injustice or discrepancy or whatever it is. It's being, oh my gosh, now you're attacking me because you're saying that my view is skewed, or you know what I mean, or is incorrect. And it's like, no, we're not. That's not an attack on you. And so there kind of ends up this like victim kind of response that just leads everybody in two different directions.
Right. And it's also a type of hypocrisy, because you're basically saying, I want to express my opinion and I want you to listen to it and to accept it, but I don't want to do the same for you.
Right.
And it's just, and that's basically what it comes down to at the core. And once you get past that is when you're actually able to have meaningful conversations, because especially in this scenario, I feel like there's, I don't think this is conscious. I feel like it's exactly what you're saying, but listening, I don't know if it's just uncomfortable listening to, that's the narrative I hear a lot, is that it gets uncomfortable for white people specifically to kind of be challenged on it. But then the question I always ask is why? Where is that actually coming from? Because I'm not yet able to really. I think it's different for different people, but until you can pinpoint that, you can't really get over what the issue is.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think that, like, yeah, I mean, that's the sticking point, that, that's where we always kind of get stuck with this, is that there's this just kind of lack of even being able to acknowledge that. And I think that, like, white guilt is a very, very, very real thing, and people avoid thinking about it, talking about it, feeling it, hearing it. It's much more easier to just not talk about it. I mean, you look at, like, our history books and how things were skewed to just kind of make things not as brutal as they were, and that's to kind of assuage that white guilt. But nobody is really worried about the continued trauma that inflicts on on those whose history is being erased or is being
Right.
changed. I think people have to be, being mindful is about getting curious. And so there's a discomfort with paying attention to these things, and to being able to really look at how our country has been built and kind of the history behind it. I think that's a question for mindfulness. That's a question to kind of look into internally and feel like, well, why is this difficult for me? Why does this make me so uncomfortable? There's reasons there, but everybody has to be willing to look inside of themselves to do that. But I think a lot of times, and right now, I mean, I think we're in a place where there's people who are not interested in getting involved and in trying to help out with marginalized communities, but there's kind of a group of people that want to get involved. And I think that guilt kind of pushes them to wanting to get involved, but also there's still this armor that's up. And so you see people going into these spaces and wanting to get involved, but still really not being willing to be vulnerable themselves.
Yeah.
So we've got to be vulnerable to be able to really make any kind of progress and understand each other.
I think it's also important to understand the complexity and how ingrained it is in everything in our society. I'm just thinking back to the HBO thing, and it really is because the capitalist system we have. I don't want to say it's in what I'm in specifically what I'm saying is racist, but it doesn't have a moral compass.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true, that, with this corporate system, the bottom line is money. And I think, I feel like communities of color, Black people, are used to that. Like, I don't think that people really expect what may be considered, if firing Bill Maher, getting rid of his show, would be considered like justice for what he said. I don't think anybody really actually expects that's going to happen. I think we're pretty used to continued injustice, I mean, from things like this, where it's not as huge of an offense as something like someone being an unarmed person being shot down by the police, and then the police getting off and getting sent back to work with back pay a few months later. And so it's one of those things that I think part of mindfulness and part of awareness is recognizing that there's a lot at play. There's a lot of things that are keeping these systems going. And so if we can find a way to continually be aware of those things and not expect immediate change, but really work for long-term policy shifts and things, that's kind of where the change is going to happen, because it's not going to happen overnight. There's so much that we're dealing with, and I don't want to add too much to the discussion because we're getting towards the end, but even just thinking about, our Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, and his agenda and the things that he's doing, and bringing back mandatory minimum sentencing. And really it's very clear with his agenda that there's an attack on Black community, poor communities, and so we're in for the long haul right now, and I think I do like that when things like this happen with Bill Maher, it gives us an opportunity for deeper discussion. I did see some really, really insightful threads on Facebook, one from Angela Rye, who's amazing, and she's on CNN, and she talked about the impact of that term, and how it impacts our community still now, and how the idea of house slaves and field slaves has led to the continued division in the Black community with colorism and things. And so a lot of this stuff wouldn't even be getting talked about with a broader audience right now if Bill Maher wasn't an idiot and didn't say what he said. So, that I try to pay attention to that so that I don't get so frustrated with what's actually happening. And hopefully we gave you guys a different perspective on these two different issues. So, all right. Thanks, guys.